The red light on the broadcast console had been blinking for 6 hours straight, which meant the transmitter was still alive, which meant the signal was still going out, which meant that somewhere beyond the reinforced walls of this building, beyond the rain, beyond the highway choked with abandoned cars, beyond the tree line where shapes moved in ways that no longer followed the logic of living things, there was still a chance that someone was hearing my voice. That was the only reason I hadn't stopped talking. Not courage, not duty, just the blinking of a small red light that I had chosen to interpret as proof that the world had not yet finished ending. I should back up. I should explain how I ended up alone in a government broadcast station in rural Oregon, talking to an audience I could not see and could not count, reading emergency messages that no government remained to authorize. I should explain who I was before the crisis made me into something I never intended to become. But the truth is that before has started to feel like a foreign country, a place I once visited and can describe from memory, but can no longer reach by any road that still exists. So I'll do my best. Before the collapse, I was nobody important. I was a 34-year-old communications technician assigned to the Region 9 Emergency Alert Facility outside Colton, Oregon. That title sounds significant until you understand what it actually meant. I maintained broadcast equipment, ran weekly test signals, and stayed current on federal emergency management protocols that governed what we were allowed to say to the public and when we were allowed to say it. The facility itself was a repurposed county maintenance building set back from a 2-lane highway behind a tree line thick enough to hide it from casual traffic. The government had leased it in 2019 as part of a continuity of communications program that nobody in the civilian world had ever heard of. We were a relay point, one node in a distributed network designed to keep functioning if pieces of it went dark. The theory assumed the crisis would always be local. The theory assumed there would always be other nodes. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm telling you that now because you should know who's speaking, and because there were moments during those final days when I had to say my own name aloud into the microphone just to remember that I was still a person and not simply a function. A voice without a name is just noise. I had enough noise already. There were 6 of us assigned to the station full-time. Greg Harmon was the facility director, a retired Army signals officer in his late 50s who treated every shift rotation like a deployment and every equipment check like a field inspection. He was rigid, humorless, and so thoroughly competent that you forgave him for both. Linda Chow handled administrative coordination with FEMA Region 10 in Bothell, Washington. She was the one who translated bureaucratic directives into plain English and made sure our paperwork survived audit cycles. Marcus Webb shared technical duties with me. He was younger, sharper with software, and had the kind of dark humor that made 12-hour shifts survivable. Priya Singh managed the satellite uplink that connected our local broadcast to the national redistribution hub. And Dave Kessler was our security officer, which in practice meant he carried a sidearm, maintained a laminated access list, and spent most of his time reading paperback thrillers in the front vestibule. 6 people in a building designed to function as a small, forgettable organ in a much larger body. We never expected the body to die. The first official bulletin arrived on a Tuesday in late October. I had just come down from the roof where I'd been replacing a corroded antenna coupling in a wind that cut straight through my jacket, and my hands were still numb when Greg called us into the primary broadcast room. He read the directive from his screen the way he read everything, flat, precise, without editorial. The Centers for Disease Control had issued a Tier 3 public health advisory regarding a rapidly spreading pathogen of unknown origin. Confirmed cases had been reported in 11 states. The pathogen appeared to cause severe neurological deterioration, followed by aggressive, non-responsive behavior in infected individuals. We were ordered to begin broadcasting scripted emergency alerts on a rotating cycle. Stay indoors. Avoid physical contact with symptomatic persons. Await further instructions. Marcus leaned over to me during the briefing and whispered, "Neurological deterioration, followed by aggressive non-responsive behavior. That's a hell of a way to not say zombie." I didn't laugh. Something in the language had caught me, not the euphemism, but the word rapidly. Federal bulletins never used that word. They used emerging, or developing, or evolving. Rapidly meant the language itself couldn't keep up with what it was describing. We began broadcasting that evening. The first cycle was routine. I read the approved script into the primary microphone. Marcus monitored signal strength across our frequency band. Priya confirmed the satellite uplink was carrying our feed to the national hub. The script was measured, calm, and carefully emptied of anything that might cause panic. It told people to prepare without telling them what they were preparing for. It told them help was coming without specifying from where or when. It was, in other words, a government document, designed not to inform, but to manage the interval between ignorance and catastrophe. For the first 3 days, the system worked exactly as designed. We rotated broadcast shifts in pairs, 8 hours on, 8 hours off. Bulletins came down the chain from FEMA, through regional coordination, and into our approved script queue. Each update was slightly more urgent than the last, but the urgency was always expressed in the same controlled vocabulary, the same bureaucratic grammar that kept panic at arm's length. Evacuation corridors were established. National Guard units were mobilized. The President addressed the nation twice, once to assure the public that the situation was contained, and once, 18 hours later, to declare a national state of emergency. Between those two addresses, the confirmed case count jumped from 11 states to 31. I was monitoring the incoming feed when the first deviation occurred. It was a Thursday night, around 2 in the morning. I was alone in the broadcast room. Marcus was asleep in the break room. Everyone else was in the small bunk area we'd set up in the storage bay. The national feed, which had been cycling updated bulletins every 90 minutes, suddenly went silent for 47 minutes. Not static, not signal loss. Clean, empty silence. The kind that meant the transmitter on the other end was still powered, but nobody was speaking into it. When the feed resumed, the new bulletin was shorter than any previous one and contained a phrase I had never seen in an official emergency communication. Maintain position and await contact. Not await further instructions. Not coordinate with regional command. Await contact. As if the people writing the bulletin were no longer sure who would be making contact, or from where. I logged the anomaly and woke Greg. He read the bulletin twice, checked the authentication codes, they were valid, and told me to continue broadcasting the previous approved script until the new one was confirmed through secondary channels. Then he went into his office and closed the door. And through the thin wall, I could hear him trying to reach Bothell on the landline. He tried for an hour. Nobody answered. By Friday morning, the texture of our work had changed. The bulletins were still arriving, but they had become shorter, less specific, and more frequently contradicted by what we could observe through other channels. Portland's local emergency frequencies were overwhelmed with traffic. Fire departments calling for backup that wasn't coming. Police dispatchers whose voices had lost the practiced calm of training. We picked up fragments of military communications on bands we weren't supposed to be monitoring. Marcus had quietly expanded our receiver range 2 days earlier without asking Greg's permission, and Greg had noticed and said nothing, which told me more about his assessment of the situation than any briefing could have. The fragments were bad. I heard a National Guard unit outside Salem requesting permission to fall back from a containment line that had been breached in 3 places. I heard a helicopter pilot report that Interstate 5 south of Portland was impassable. Not from traffic, but from a mass movement event that he described in a voice so flat it sounded sedated. I heard someone on a military frequency say very clearly, "We are not equipped for this. Repeat, we are not equipped." And then the transmission cut to static. None of this was reflected in the official bulletins. The bulletins still spoke of containment measures, coordination efforts, and resource deployment. They still ended with, "Remain calm and follow the instructions of local authorities." The gap between what the bulletins described and what the radio frequencies revealed was widening by the hour. And that gap was where the real terror lived. Not in the infected, not in the violence, but in the slow, nauseating realization that the people responsible for managing the crisis had lost the ability to perceive it accurately, or had perceived it accurately and were choosing to lie. On Saturday, Linda lost contact with Bothell permanently. She had been exchanging encrypted emails with her counterpart at Region 10 twice daily, and the Saturday morning exchange simply never came. She tried every backup communication path in the protocol manual: landline, satellite phone, dedicated emergency frequency. Nothing. At noon, she walked into the broadcast room where I was mid-cycle and told me, quietly, so that her voice wouldn't carry through the walls, that she believed the Region 10 hub had been evacuated or overrun. I asked her which she thought was more likely. She didn't answer. That afternoon, Dave Kessler saw the first infected person from the station. He was checking the perimeter, a routine he'd upgraded from once daily to every 3 hours. And he came back through the rear entrance with his sidearm drawn and his face the color of wet concrete. He said there was a woman in the tree line at the north edge of the property. She was wearing a hospital gown and one shoe. She was walking, but not the way people walk. He said her head was wrong, tilted at an angle that suggested the muscles on one side of her neck had stopped working. And she was moving toward the building with the slow, deliberate gait of someone following a sound or a smell rather than a thought. Greg told Dave to secure the doors and not engage. The woman drifted along the tree line for 2 hours and then moved off toward the highway. Nobody spoke about it at dinner, but nobody slept well that night either. Sunday was the day the national feed stopped. It didn't fade or degrade. At 3:22 in the afternoon, mid-bulletin, the feed cut to a tone. The steady, single-frequency tone that the emergency broadcast system uses to signal a channel hold. The tone lasted for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Then it stopped, and what replaced it was silence. Not the brief, recoverable silence of a technical interruption, but the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against the walls of the room and fills the space where a human voice used to be. I sat in the broadcast chair and stared at the receiver and waited for the feed to resume. I waited for an hour, then 2, then 5. It never came back. Greg gathered all 6 of us in the broadcast room that evening and delivered the shortest briefing of his career. The national feed is down. Bothell is offline. Portland Metro frequencies are either silent or automated loops. As of this moment, we are operating independently. He paused, and in that pause, I saw something I had never seen on Greg Harmon's face. The visible effort of a man deciding what to believe. We will continue broadcasting. The approved script is still valid. Our transmitter is operational. The generator has fuel for approximately 18 days at current consumption. We will maintain our mission until we receive orders to do otherwise, or until continuing becomes impossible. Nobody argued. Nobody asked what impossible meant. We all understood that the word was doing the work of a dozen harder sentences that Greg could not bring himself to say. I took the first independent broadcast shift that night. No national feed to relay. No approved script updates. Just me, the microphone, and the red blinking light that said the transmitter was pushing my signal out into whatever was left of the world. For the first hour, I read the last approved bulletin on rotation, the way we'd been trained. But sometime around midnight, sitting in that dim room with the rain hitting the roof and the generator humming beneath the floor, I deviated. I don't know exactly when I crossed the line from reading the script to speaking for myself. It happened the way most important things happen. Not as a decision, but as a failure to stop. "This is the Region 9 Emergency Alert Facility in Colton, Oregon," I said. "My name is Ethan Carter. I am a communications technician. I am broadcasting on this frequency because the national emergency feed has been interrupted and I have received no updated instructions. If you are hearing this, I want you to know that this station is still operational. I will continue to broadcast for as long as I am able. You are not alone." I said those last 4 words without planning to, and as soon as they left my mouth, I felt their weight. The presumption of them, the promise embedded in them that I had no authority or ability to keep. But I also knew, in the part of my mind that operates below language, that someone out there might be sitting in a dark room with a battery-powered radio pressed to their ear, listening for exactly those words. And that possibility was enough. The responses began the next day. Marcus had configured our equipment to receive as well as transmit across a broadened frequency range. And on Monday morning, day 6 of the crisis, day 1 of our independence, we picked up our first incoming signal. It was faint, laced with static, and it came from what Marcus triangulated as somewhere in the southern Willamette Valley. A man's voice, strained and hoarse, repeating a loop. "Can anyone hear this? We are at the Cottage Grove fire station. 14 people. We need medical supplies. Can anyone hear this?" I responded immediately. I told him we could hear him, gave him our location, and asked about conditions in his area. There was a long pause, long enough that I thought we'd lost the signal. And then his voice came back, and it was different. The mechanical, rehearsed quality of his loop was gone, replaced by something raw and cracked. "Oh God," he said. "Oh God, someone's actually there." He started to cry. I held the transmit button and let him hear me breathing because I didn't know what else to give him. His name was Ray. He told me the Cottage Grove area had been overrun 3 days earlier. The fire station was intact but surrounded. They had water from the building's supply, but almost no food and only basic first aid materials. 2 of the 14 people were badly injured. Bite wounds that had been cauterized with a heated piece of rebar because they had no surgical equipment and had heard from someone that burning the wound site could slow the infection. I didn't know if that was true. I told him I would broadcast his location and situation on our outgoing signal in case anyone with medical resources was listening. It was the only thing I could offer, and it was almost nothing. That first contact opened a door that never closed. Over the next 3 days, we received transmissions from 11 different sources. A family barricaded in a feed store in Roseburg. A group of college students who had fortified a dormitory at Oregon State in Corvallis and were running low on water. A retired electrician in Eugene who had rigged a ham radio from salvaged parts and was methodically cataloging the status of every neighborhood within walking distance of his house. Which blocks were overrun, which were still passable, where bodies had been piled and burned by survivors attempting to create fire breaks. A woman who identified herself only as dispatch and who was transmitting from what she said was a state police frequency. She gave us grid coordinates for areas where she believed organized resistance was still functioning, but she would not say where she was or how she was accessing the channel. And her transmissions were always exactly 90 seconds long before she cut off. Each contact brought information, and each piece of information complicated our picture of what was happening. The infected were not uniformly distributed. They seemed to concentrate along transportation corridors and population centers, flowing outward from cities like water following the path of least resistance. Rural areas were less saturated, but not safe. Isolated homesteads had been hit by wandering clusters that seemed to move without purpose, but with a terrifying, almost tidal persistence. Noise attracted them. Light attracted them at night. They did not coordinate, but they aggregated. A single infected individual moving through an area would somehow accumulate others, as if the motion itself generated a gravity that pulled nearby infected into alignment. Within days, a lone drifter could become a column of 30 or 50, moving in a ragged line toward whatever stimulus had initiated the movement. The government, as far as we could determine, had ceased to exist as a functioning entity. We never picked up a transmission that sounded like centralized authority. No presidential addresses. No FEMA coordination. No military command structure issuing orders. What we heard instead were fragments, isolated units operating on their own initiative, local officials trying to manage situations that had exceeded their training and resources by orders of magnitude. And silence. Vast, expanding zones of silence where signals had once been and no longer were. By Wednesday of the second week, our own situation had begun to deteriorate. The generator was consuming fuel at a steady rate, and Greg's 18-day estimate was holding, but the arithmetic was merciless. Every day the tank gauge dropped by a predictable increment, and that increment was a countdown to the moment when the transmitter would go dark. Food was a more immediate problem. Our supply cage had been stocked for 2 weeks of normal operations, meaning meals for 6 people at a caloric level designed for sedentary desk work. Under the stress and irregular sleep patterns of our current situation, we were eating faster than the plan assumed. Linda inventoried the remaining supplies on Wednesday evening and reported that we had approximately 5 days of food at reduced rations, or 3 days at the level we'd been consuming. The perimeter was the worst of it. Since Dave's first sighting, the frequency of infected individuals near the building had increased steadily. They were not massing, not yet, but their presence had shifted from occasional to persistent. At any given time, looking out through the small reinforced windows that lined the broadcast room, you could see 2 or 3 figures moving in the tree line or standing motionless on the access road. They seemed drawn to the building, though whether by sound, light, or some other stimulus we couldn't identify, none of us knew. Dave had reinforced the exterior doors with filing cabinets and steel shelving from the storage bay, but the building had never been designed for physical security. It was a maintenance shed that had been given a mission above its station, and the walls were commercial construction, adequate for weather and privacy, but not for siege. On Thursday, we lost Dave. He had gone out at dawn to check the generator's external fuel coupling, a task that required 60 seconds of exposure outside the rear door. Greg had argued against it. He wanted to run a line through the wall so the coupling could be checked from inside. But the modification required tools we didn't have, and the fuel gauge had begun reading inconsistently, which Dave suspected was a connection issue at the coupling itself. He went out armed, with Marcus watching from the window. The coupling was 15 feet from the door. Dave reached it, knelt down, and began checking the connection. Marcus said later that the infected came from underneath the generator housing. It had been lying in the narrow crawl space beneath the raised platform, motionless, invisible. And it moved with a speed that contradicted everything we thought we understood about their physical capabilities. Dave never fired his weapon. By the time Marcus got the door open, it was too late to intervene in any way that would have saved him, and too dangerous to attempt to recover the body. We sealed the rear entrance permanently after that. Greg drove 3 steel rods through the door frame, using a hammer and a piece of pipe as a punch, and we piled everything heavy we could find against it. The building now had a single point of entry, the front door, and a single point of exit. I understood, with the quiet, clinical clarity that extreme stress sometimes produces, that we had just reduced our options by half. That night I made the broadcast that I have replayed in my memory more than any other. It was not the most important thing I said during those weeks, and it was not the most useful. But it was the most honest. This is Ethan Carter at the Region 9 facility. I've been talking to you for 6 days now, and I want to tell you something that isn't in any emergency script. I'm scared. We lost someone today. A good man who went outside to do a 60-second job and didn't come back. There are 5 of us left in this building, and I don't know how long we can stay. I don't know if the things I've been telling you have helped anyone. I don't know if the frequencies I've relayed or the coordinates I've passed along have saved a single life. But I know that every time I sit down at this microphone and press the transmit button, I am making a choice to believe that you exist. That someone is hearing this. And I'm asking you to make the same choice about me. Stay alive. Stay listening. I'll be here. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within an hour, 3 separate stations had transmitted back, not requesting help, not reporting conditions, but simply acknowledging. A woman in Bend, Oregon said, "We hear you, Ethan. Keep going." A man transmitting from somewhere on the coast said, "You are heard." And a child's voice, a child, on a frequency so faint it was barely distinguishable from static, said, "My dad says thank you." I had to leave the broadcast room for several minutes after that. I went into the bathroom and sat on the floor and pressed my hands against my face and made sounds that I will not describe, because some things should remain private even in a testimony that is meant to leave nothing out. The days that followed compressed into a rhythm that was equal parts purpose and dread. Each morning I cataloged our resources: fuel, food, water, ammunition. Dave's sidearm and the 37 rounds he'd left behind were now our only weapon. Each afternoon I broadcast, cycling between updated emergency information from our listener network and my own voice, talking to the darkness beyond the walls. Each evening, the 5 of us, Greg, Linda, Marcus, Priya, and I, sat in the broadcast room together and shared whatever intelligence had come in during the day, assembling a picture of the outside world from fragments the way you might reconstruct a shattered plate, knowing the shape of what it used to be, but seeing mostly the gaps. The picture was bleak. Portland was gone. Not destroyed, but emptied of organized human life. The fragments we'd heard from the city had dwindled to a single repeating automated loop on the police frequency, which meant the transmitter was still powered, but no one was left to operate it. Salem had gone silent 2 days after Portland. Eugene was holding in scattered pockets, according to our electrician contact, but his reports were growing shorter, and his transmission schedule was becoming irregular, which I recognized as the signature of someone whose situation was collapsing incrementally. The college students in Corvallis stopped transmitting on a Friday and never resumed. Ray at the Cottage Grove fire station reported that his group had dropped from 14 to 9, and that 2 of the remaining 9 were showing early symptoms. He asked me, in a voice so quiet I could barely hear it over the static, whether I thought it was better to tell someone they were infected or to let them figure it out themselves. I told him that people deserve the truth. It was the right answer, and also a completely inadequate one. And I have thought about Ray's question almost every day since. On the 9th day of independent broadcasting, something changed in the signal environment. Marcus noticed it first. He had a technician's ear for anomaly, the ability to hear a pattern disruption the way a musician hears a wrong note. He called me into the monitoring bay at 3 in the morning and pointed to the spectrum analyzer. "There," he said, That wasn't there 6 hours ago. What he was showing me was a new signal on a frequency band that had been dead since the national feed went down. It was not a voice. It was a data burst. A rapid, compressed transmission that repeated on a 60-second cycle. The frequency was military. The encoding format was one I recognized from the classified protocol manuals Greg kept in his office safe. The ones we'd been instructed to familiarize ourselves with, but told we would almost certainly never need. It was a continuity of government beacon, an automated signal designed to broadcast from secure facilities when human operators were no longer available to transmit manually. Its purpose was simple: to tell anyone with the right equipment and the right clearance that the facility still existed, that its systems were still running, and that its contents, whatever they were still intact. The beacon was transmitting from somewhere to the east. Marcus ran the triangulation twice and got the same result. The signal originated from a location approximately 300 miles east-northeast of our position, deep in the interior of Oregon, or possibly across the border into Idaho. There was nothing in our facility database that matched those coordinates. Whatever was broadcasting, it wasn't a station we'd been told about. I took this to Greg, who studied the data in his office for 20 minutes and then emerged with an expression I can only describe as carefully neutral. The face of a man who has reached a conclusion he is not ready to share. He told Marcus to continue monitoring the signal and to log any changes in frequency, strength, or cycle timing. He told me to mention it to no one outside the station. When I asked him what he thought it was, he said, "It's a door. The question is what's behind it, and whether we're in any position to walk through it." I didn't mention the beacon on my broadcasts. Not yet. I had learned, in the compressed education of those days, that hope is a resource as dangerous as ammunition, essential for survival, but catastrophic if deployed inaccurately. If I told my listeners that a government continuity signal was active, and it turned out to be an automated echo from an empty building, the damage would be worse than saying nothing. People can endure almost anything if they are not first given hope and then stripped of it. False hope is not a lesser version of real hope. It is a wound. On the 10th day, we lost Linda. It was not the infected that took her. It was the mathematics of the situation. The slow, grinding arithmetic of a crisis that kills not just with teeth and violence, but with pressure, exhaustion, and the particular cruelty of forcing good people to see clearly how bad things are. Linda had been deteriorating for days. She ate less than anyone, slept in fitful intervals, and had developed a tremor in her hands that she tried to hide by keeping them in her pockets. On the 10th morning, she came to me in the broadcast room and told me, very calmly, that she had decided to leave. Not escape. She used the word leave, and the distinction mattered. She said she had a sister in Seattle, and that she knew, rationally, that Seattle was almost certainly gone, but that she could not stay in this building and continue to not know. She said the not knowing was worse than whatever she would find. I tried to talk her out of it. Greg tried. Priya tried, and Priya was the one Linda was closest to, and even she couldn't shift it. Linda had reached the place that I think exists in every person who endures sustained crisis. The place where the mind decides, with a calm that looks like peace, but is actually a form of completion, that the current situation has extracted everything it is going to extract, and that whatever comes next, even if it is worse, will at least be different. She took a bottle of water, a flashlight, and the laminated regional map from Greg's office. She did not take any of the remaining food, which I think was her way of making a final contribution to the people she was leaving behind. Greg unlocked the front door for her at dawn, checked the immediate perimeter, and she walked out. She turned once, raised her hand, not waving, just acknowledging, and moved toward the tree line on the south side of the property, heading in the direction of the highway. We never heard from her again. I have to write that sentence and move on. I've learned that grief in a survival situation is not something you process. It's something you load onto your back and carry, and the weight becomes part of how you move. 4 of us now. The building felt larger with each person it lost, which is the opposite of how spatial perception is supposed to work. The rooms didn't change size, but the silence in them deepened, and silence has a way of expanding to fill whatever volume is available. On the 11th day, the signal environment changed again, and this time it changed in a way that frightened me, more than the infected outside the windows. The military continuity beacon that Marcus had detected 2 days earlier shifted, not in frequency or location, in content. The automated data burst, which had been cycling identically every 60 seconds, added a new component. Embedded in the burst was a brief, encoded string that, when Marcus ran it through the decryption protocol from Greg's manual, resolved into 4 words. Survivors report to waypoint. This was not an automated signal. Automated beacons don't change their content. Someone, a human being with access to a classified military communication system, had modified the transmission. Someone was alive inside that facility 300 miles to the east, and they were calling people in. I sat with that knowledge for an hour before I told anyone. Not because I wanted to withhold it, but because I needed to understand what it would mean to share it. If I broadcast those 4 words on my outgoing signal, every survivor within range of my voice would have a destination, a direction, a reason to move. But I would also be directing them toward a location I had never seen, operated by people I had never spoken to, with intentions I could not verify. I would be converting trust into motion, spending the credibility I had built over 11 days of honest broadcasting to point people toward an unknown. If the waypoint was real, I could be saving lives. If it was not, if it was a trap or a ruin, or simply a machine talking to itself in an empty room, I would be sending people to their deaths with my voice as the vehicle. Greg and I had the hardest conversation of those weeks that afternoon. We stood in his office with the door closed, and he laid it out with the blunt, structural clarity that was his particular gift. The fuel would last 7 more days. Food would last 3, maybe 4 with further rationing. The infected presence around the building was increasing. Marcus had counted 17 visible individuals from the windows that morning, the highest number yet. The building was not defensible against a concentrated approach. Staying was a death sentence with a known expiration date. Leaving was a risk with unknown odds. The beacon offered a destination, which was more than we had otherwise. The question, Greg said, is not whether to leave, it's when, and whether we tell others. I told him I wanted to broadcast the waypoint information. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "If you do that, you're making a promise you can't keep." I said I knew. He said, "People will die moving toward that signal because you told them to." I said I knew that too. He said, "Can you carry that?" And I told him what I genuinely believed, which was that I was already carrying things I didn't think I could carry, and that one more weight would either hold or it wouldn't, and that the only alternative, silence, withholding, the safety of saying nothing, was its own kind of killing. He looked at me for a long time. Then he nodded. That evening, I made the broadcast. I was careful. I was as honest as I knew how to be. I told my listeners what we had detected. A continuity of government beacon, military frequency, east of our position. I told them the beacon had been modified by a human operator, which meant someone was alive inside the facility. I told them the encoded message read, "Survivors report to waypoint." I gave them the coordinates. And then I told them what I did not know, which was everything else. Whether the facility was safe, whether it was a trap, whether the people inside had the resources or the intention to help anyone who arrived. I told them I was not making a recommendation. I was providing information, and what they did with it was their own decision, made with their own judgment, at their own risk. I will not tell you this is safe, I said into the microphone. I will not tell you this is a rescue. I am telling you that a signal exists, that it appears to be human, and that it is asking for survivors to come. I'm telling you because you have the right to know. What I know, you know. That's the only promise I've ever made on this frequency, and I'm keeping it now. The responses came in through the night. Some were hopeful. People excited to have a direction, a destination, something other than the formless endurance that had defined their survival so far. Some were suspicious. Voices asking me how I knew this wasn't a lure, a military operation designed to gather civilians for quarantine, or worse. I told each of them the same thing. I didn't know. I was giving them the data, not the interpretation. One man, I never got his name, transmitted a single sentence that stayed with me. A direction is better than a circle. On the 12th morning, we began preparing to leave. The plan was simple, because complexity was a luxury we could not afford. We would depart at first light, moving south on foot to the highway, and then east, using the regional map and a compass from the supply cage. We would carry as much food, water, and equipment as we could manage. We would maintain radio silence during movement to avoid attracting infected with electronic noise, but I would carry a portable transmitter, a battery-operated unit with limited range, and broadcast our position and status at predetermined intervals. The journey to the beacon coordinates, assuming we could average 15 miles a day on foot through terrain that might or might not be passable, would take approximately 3 weeks. We had food for 4 days. The gap between those two numbers was something we chose not to discuss in specific terms. On the 12th evening, I made my final broadcast from the station. I knew it was the final one because the fuel gauge had dropped to the level where the generator would begin cycling intermittently, and because by morning we would be gone, and the transmitter would be just a piece of metal in an empty room. I wanted the last broadcast to matter. I wanted it to carry something beyond information, some residue of the days I had spent in that chair, talking into the dark, choosing to believe that the dark contained ears. But I am not a poet or a philosopher. I am a technician who was handed a microphone by circumstance and asked to be a voice when the other voices stopped. So I said what I could. This is Ethan Carter at the Region 9 Emergency Alert Facility. This will be my last transmission from this station. In a few hours, my team and I will be leaving this building and moving east toward the signal coordinates I shared with you yesterday. I don't know what we'll find. I don't know if I'll be able to transmit again. But I want to say something to everyone who has been listening, and I want to say it plainly because I think the time for careful language is over. I paused. The red light blinked. The rain had stopped for the first time in days, and the silence outside the walls was total. I have been afraid every single day since this started. I have been afraid, and I have kept talking. And the only reason I was able to do that is because you were there. Not beside me. I know you weren't beside me. But there, on the other end of this signal, listening and answering, and telling me that someone heard. You made me brave enough to be useful, and I need you to know that. Whatever happens after tonight, I need you to know that the courage didn't come from me. It came from the knowledge that you existed. Every time you transmitted back, every time you said, "We hear you," you were keeping me alive as much as I was trying to keep you alive. It went both ways. It always goes both ways. I took a breath. If you can move east, move east. Follow the coordinates. If you can't, stay where you are and stay alive. And keep your radios on. Because someone will come looking for you. I believe that. I choose to believe that. And I am asking you to choose it too. This is Ethan Carter, signing off from Region 9. Stay alive. Stay listening. And when you hear a voice in the dark, answer it. That's how we come back from this. We answer. I released the transmit button. The red light blinked 3 more times and then held steady. The transmitter waiting for an input that wasn't coming. I sat there for several minutes, looking at that light, trying to memorize the feeling of being connected to something vast and invisible and fragile. The web of voices that I had helped sustain and that had sustained me. The network of strangers who had trusted each other with their positions, their fears, their coordinates, their names. Then I turned the transmitter off. The light went dark. The hum of the equipment faded to silence, and the silence was enormous. We left at dawn. Greg took point, moving with the economical alertness of his military training. Marcus carried the portable transmitter and the battery pack. Priya carried the medical supplies, a small kit that Linda had organized before she left, with the precision and thoughtfulness that characterized everything Linda did. I carried food, water, and Dave's sidearm, which I had fired exactly once in my life at a range in college, and which felt in my hand like an object from someone else's story that had ended up in mine by clerical error. The first 300 yards were the worst. The access road from the building to the highway was partially visible from the tree line on both sides, and we knew the infected were present in those trees. We moved fast and close together, and I will not pretend that my breathing was steady or that my hands were calm. But the infected we could see, 4 figures, standing at intervals in the trees like posts in a broken fence, did not approach. They watched, or seemed to watch, with that terrible stillness that was somehow worse than movement, and we passed through their observation without triggering whatever stimulus converts their passivity into pursuit. The highway was a graveyard of vehicles. Cars, trucks, an overturned school bus, all empty, doors open, as if their occupants had left in a collective instant. We moved along the shoulder, stepping over debris that told compressed stories. A suitcase burst open, children's clothing scattered across the asphalt. A dog's leash tied to a guardrail, the collar still attached but the dog gone. A cell phone, screen cracked, lying face up in a puddle with its lock screen showing a family photo. 2 parents, 2 kids, a golden retriever, all of them smiling at whoever held the camera, frozen in a moment that predated the one that erased them. I looked at these things and I kept walking. That was the new skill. Not courage, not resilience, just the ability to see and keep walking, to let the seeing happen without letting it stop the motion. The world was full of evidence now. Every object was a testimony. The trick was not to become a courtroom, weighing and judging each piece, but to be a road, letting the evidence exist on either side while you moved through it towards something you hoped was ahead. We made 12 miles the first day. That night, camped in a roadside maintenance shed that Greg cleared room by room with Dave's sidearm and a flashlight, I assembled the portable transmitter and made our first mobile broadcast. Range was limited, maybe 20 miles in good conditions, but I transmitted our position, our heading, and the beacon coordinates, repeating the message 3 times before powering down to conserve the battery. The response came not from any of my regular contacts, but from a voice I had never heard. A man transmitting from a location he identified as the Warm Springs compound, which I took to mean somewhere on or near the Warm Springs Reservation east of the Cascades. He said there were 60 people there. 60. The largest surviving group I had heard of since the crisis began. They had established a perimeter, were growing food in irrigated plots, and had been monitoring my broadcasts from Region 9 since the 4th day. He said my broadcasts had been relayed eastward by a chain of ham radio operators positioned along the Cascade passes, some of whom were no longer transmitting, which meant they were no longer alive, which meant they had spent their final days passing my voice along like a baton in a relay race they knew they would not finish. I had to stop transmitting for a moment after he told me that. He said the Warm Springs compound had also detected the military beacon and had sent a scouting party toward the coordinates 6 days earlier. The party had not yet returned, but their last transmission, received 2 days ago, reported that they had visual confirmation of a facility, a physical structure, guarded, with lights and activity suggesting human habitation. They described fencing, vehicle movement, and what appeared to be a landing strip. The scouts' final words, before the transmission ended, were, "It's real. It's manned. Approaching for contact." I asked the man from Warm Springs what he made of it. He said, "I make of it the same thing you make of it. It's a reason to keep going." The next days blurred into a rhythm of movement, caution, and the constant background calculus of survival. How far to the next water source? How many calories remained? How much battery life the transmitter still held? How many rounds were in the sidearm that I increasingly understood I would not be able to use effectively if I needed to? The terrain changed as we moved east, the wet, dense forests of the western Cascades giving way to drier, more open country where visibility improved, but cover diminished. We saw infected intermittently, usually at a distance, moving along roads or through open fields, following patterns of drift that seemed governed by stimuli we could not perceive. Twice we had to detour significantly to avoid clusters that blocked our route. Once, crossing a bridge over a river whose name I never learned, we encountered a single infected individual standing motionless at the center of the span, facing upstream, as still as a statue. We skirted it at maximum distance along the opposite railing, and it did not move, did not turn, did not acknowledge our existence. Priya whispered that she thought it was listening to the water, and I told her that was impossible, and neither of us believed me. On the 5th day of travel, Greg's left knee gave out. He'd been favoring it since the 2nd day, saying nothing, adjusting his gait so subtly that none of us noticed, until the joint finally failed on a descent and he went down hard on the gravel shoulder. He got back up immediately. Greg Harmon was not a man who stayed down, but from that point forward his pace dropped, and with it, ours. We were averaging 8 miles a day now, instead of 12. The food was gone. We were living on what we could find. Creek water purified with iodine tablets from the medical kit, cattail roots that Priya knew how to identify and prepare, and on one occasion, a can of pinto beans discovered in the glove compartment of an abandoned truck, which the 4 of us split with a solemnity usually reserved for communion. On the 7th night, Marcus picked up a new signal. It was not the beacon. It was not any of our previous contacts. It was a frequency I did not recognize, carrying a transmission that was unlike anything we had encountered. Not voice, not automated data burst, but something between the two. A human voice, speaking in English, but in a cadence that sounded rehearsed, almost liturgical, as if the speaker were reading from a text with the careful enunciation of someone who wanted every syllable to survive the static. Coordinated reception available at the following designations: Baker, operational; Whitehorse, operational; Colville, operational; Sandpoint, operational; Waypoint designation Evergreen, operational and receiving; Repeat cycle. Then the voice started again from the beginning. It was a loop, but a human-operated loop. Someone sitting at a microphone, reading a list, starting over when they reached the end. The locations named were spread across eastern Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and into Montana. 5 sites, all described as operational. The word receiving attached to the last one, Evergreen, suggested it was the hub, the center, the place where the others were sending whatever they gathered. I looked at Marcus. He was already running coordinates. The designation Evergreen matched the location of the military beacon we had been following. Greg, sitting against a concrete highway barrier with his swollen knee elevated on a rolled jacket, studied the data and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "That's not a bunker talking to itself. That's a network." He was right. What the transmission described was not a single surviving installation, but a system. Multiple nodes, distributed, communicating, operational. Someone had built, or rebuilt, or preserved a network of survival points across the interior Northwest, and they were broadcasting their existence to anyone with the equipment and knowledge to hear it. I thought about the chain of ham radio operators along the Cascade Passes, who had relayed my broadcasts eastward until they died at their stations. I thought about Ray in Cottage Grove, and the woman who called herself Dispatch, and the college students in Corvallis who stopped transmitting on a Friday. I thought about the retired electrician in Eugene, methodically mapping his dying city block by block. I thought about Linda walking into the trees with a bottle of water and a laminated map. I thought about Dave, who went outside to check a fuel coupling and was taken by something that had been waiting in the dark beneath the generator, patient and still and hungry. All of those people had been nodes too. Not in a designed network, not in a system anyone had planned, but in the improvised, desperate, deeply human network that forms when people refuse to stop reaching for each other across distances that should make reaching impossible. Every voice I had heard on that radio, every transmission I had relayed, every response I had received, each one was a proof that the instinct to connect is not a luxury that collapses under pressure, but a structural element that becomes more visible when everything else falls away. I made my broadcast that night with a clarity I had not felt before. I transmitted the new signal's content, the 5 operational sites, the designations, the coordinates Marcus had calculated. I gave our own position and heading. And I added something that was not information, but conviction. There is a network. It is real. It is human. And it is waiting for you. We walked for 3 more days. Greg's knee forced us to a pace that felt like crawling. Priya developed a cough that none of us mentioned because mentioning it would require considering its implications. Marcus carried the transmitter in the sidearm now, because I had admitted to myself and to him that he was a better shot and steadier under pressure than I was, and that pride was a resource I could no longer afford. I carried the radio and the voice because that was what I had always carried, and because by now the voice felt less like a tool and more like an organ, something that had grown into me during those days in the station, something I could not remove without removing part of myself. On the 10th day of travel, the 21st day since the crisis began, we reached the edge of a broad valley rimmed by low, dry mountains. The road we had been following descended from a pass and curved southward through open grassland toward a distant cluster of structures that, even from 5 miles away, were visibly different from the abandoned buildings we had been passing for weeks. These had lights. Not the cold, automated glow of systems running on inertia, but the warm, irregular, unmistakably human light of inhabited spaces. Windows lit from within, exterior lamps positioned along a perimeter, the moving beams of flashlights or lanterns held by people doing the ordinary work of living. Greg stopped walking. We all stopped. For a moment, the four of us stood on that hillside and looked down at the valley and said nothing, because the sight was doing something to us that language would only diminish. Then my radio crackled. The signal was strong, stronger than anything I had received since leaving the station. It was the same voice from the loop transmission, the careful, liturgical cadence, but this time it was not looping. This time it was speaking directly, and it was speaking to us. Unidentified party on the eastern approach. We have visual on your position. Identify yourselves and state your point of origin. Marcus looked at me. Greg looked at me. Priya looked at me. And I understood in that moment that this was what all of it had been for. Every broadcast, every night in the chair with the red light blinking, every word I had spoken into the void on the faith that the void contained ears. It had been for this. The moment when the signal stopped being a signal and became a bridge. When the voice on the other end was not a stranger, but a destination. I pressed the transmit button.
This is Ethan Carter, formerly of the Region 9 Emergency Alert Facility in Colton, Oregon. I have 3 people with me. We have been traveling east for 10 days following your beacon. We are unarmed and in need of food, water, and medical attention. I paused. I've been broadcasting on emergency frequencies since the national feed went down. If you've been listening, you may have heard me. The silence lasted long enough that I began to doubt, not the signal, not the lights in the valley, but myself. My assumption that connection was a thing that could be completed, that the reaching and the arrival were parts of the same motion. Then the voice came back, and it was no longer liturgical. It was warm and tired, and human in the way that only voices that have endured something can be. Ethan Carter, we've been hearing you for 12 days. Waypoint Evergreen is operational and receiving. Come on in.
I would like to tell you that I said something eloquent, that I found words adequate to the moment, to the weeks of fear and noise and darkness, to Dave and Linda and the people I couldn't help, and the people I tried to help, and the people who helped me without knowing they were doing it. But I didn't say anything. I handed the radio to Marcus because my hands were shaking too badly to hold it, and I sat down on the gravel shoulder of that road and looked at the lights in the valley below. And for the first time in 21 days, I let myself believe that the signal had been worth sending. We descended through the last mile in twilight. The perimeter was fenced, chain link topped with concertina wire, reinforced with vehicle barriers at the gates. Armed personnel met us at the entrance, checked us for bites and fever with a brisk, practiced efficiency that suggested they had performed this intake dozens of times, and led us through the gate into what I can only describe as a functioning community. Not a camp, not a bunker. A community. With structures, systems, gardens, a medical station, children, noise, cooking smoke, and the dense, layered sound of human beings living in proximity to each other, which is a sound I had forgotten and which hit me with a force that was physiologically indistinguishable from grief. They gave us food, water, and cots in a building that had been converted into receiving quarters. A medic examined Greg's knee and Priya's cough and pronounced both treatable. Marcus fell asleep within minutes of lying down. I sat on the edge of my cot, too exhausted and too wired to sleep, and stared at the ceiling of a building I had not built, surrounded by people I had not known existed 3 weeks ago, alive for reasons that I could partially trace to my own actions, but that were mostly traceable to a chain of choices made by hundreds of people I would never meet, each of whom had decided, at some point during the worst days of their lives, to reach for a stranger across a distance that should have been impossible. In the morning,
I asked to see the communications center. They led me to a building near the center of the compound, a low, concrete-reinforced structure bristling with antenna arrays, powered by solar panels and a bank of salvaged batteries. Inside, 3 operators were monitoring a wall of receivers, and the room was filled with the low, continuous murmur of incoming signals. Voices from the other operational waypoints, from isolated survivor groups, from individuals transmitting on handheld radios and car batteries and jury-rigged ham sets, each one a thread in the web that this place had been quietly weaving while the world fell apart. The lead operator, a woman named Vasquez, who had the bearing and vocabulary of career military, showed me their signal map. A hand-drawn chart covering one wall, marked with the positions of every confirmed transmission source they had logged. There were over 200. Scattered across 6 states, clustered along river valleys and mountain passes, concentrated around the 5 waypoint designations, but extending far beyond them. The map described a geography of survival that was larger, more distributed, and more resilient than anything I had imagined during my days in the station. "You did something important," Vasquez told me, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating a logistical reality rather than offering a compliment. "Your broadcasts gave people a reason to turn their radios on. Once they turned their radios on, we could find them." I looked at the map. I looked at the hundreds of small marks, each one representing a voice I might have heard, a person who might have heard me. And I thought about what Vasquez had said. Not the praise, but the mechanism. I had not saved anyone. I had not organized a rescue, or led an evacuation, or built a shelter. I had done something simpler and, I now understood, something more fundamental. I had made noise. Deliberate, sustained, human noise in a world that was collapsing into silence. And the noise had given other people permission to make noise too. And the accumulated noise had become a signal, and the signal had become a network, and the network had become this. A room full of murmuring receivers, a map full of marks, a compound full of people who were alive because they had refused to be quiet. I was standing there, absorbing this, when Vasquez said, "There's something else you should hear." She led me to a receiver at the far end of the console, isolated from the others, connected to an antenna array that she said was oriented due north. She put a pair of headphones over my ears and adjusted the frequency. For a moment, I heard only static, the deep oceanic hiss of empty spectrum. Then, faintly, like a voice heard through water, a transmission resolved. It was not in English. The language was unfamiliar to me. Vasquez said her best guess was Norwegian or possibly Icelandic. The voice was female, calm, and transmitting on a frequency that corresponded to no known American military or civilian band. The signal was weak but clean, which meant it was distant but well transmitted. A powerful station, professionally operated, pushing a signal across what Vasquez estimated was at least 3,000 miles. "We picked it up 4 days ago," Vasquez said. "It cycles every 30 minutes. We haven't been able to translate the full content, but there are embedded English-language phrases, safe harbor, receiving survivors, and a set of coordinates that correspond to the northern coast of Iceland." I pulled one ear of the headphones away and looked at her. "Iceland," I said. "Iceland," she confirmed. "Isolated, cold, low population density, hard to reach by land, which means hard for the infected to reach. If any place on Earth has a chance of remaining uncompromised, it's an island in the North Atlantic." I listened for another full cycle. The voice was steady, patient, repeating its message with the same careful cadence I had heard in the waypoint loop. The cadence of someone who knows they are speaking into uncertainty and has made peace with the possibility that no one is listening, but who keeps speaking anyway, because the act of speaking is itself
a refusal to concede. I understood that cadence. I had lived inside it for 11 days. Vasquez pulled the headphones gently from my ears and said, "We're trying to establish two-way contact. We haven't succeeded yet. Our transmission power isn't strong enough to reach them reliably at that distance. But we're working on it." She paused. "We could use someone who knows how to talk to people through a microphone. Someone who understands that the voice matters as much as the information." I looked at the receiver. I looked at the map on the wall with its 200 marks. I looked at the room full of murmuring signals, each one a life, each one a choice to speak rather than go silent. And I thought about the woman's voice from across the ocean, calm and steady and persistent, reaching across 3,000 miles of water and static and ruin to say two words that I had said myself, in a different language, from a different chair, in a different country, during the worst days of my life. Safe harbor. I sat down at the console. I put the headphones on. I pulled the microphone toward me and waited for the next cycle to end. For the pause between repetitions where a new voice might slip in, where a signal from the far side of a broken continent might reach across the Atlantic and make contact with a voice that was already reaching back. The red transmit light came on. It blinked once, twice, and held steady. I pressed the button and began to speak.